Okay, so let's look at chapter 1, what we're going to be covering. It's kind of the introduction of what this textbook's about, and it's going to go over several different themes in biology. It's going to look at evolution. It's going to look at just very briefly. And then it's also going to look at the scientific method and hypothesis versus a theory versus a law. Now, you also need to read this chapter. After you go through this PowerPoint, then I would go ahead and do the end of chapter questions. And those are the ones that are in the book and that you get to choose which one from each level. Your instructions are there on Brightspace. Make sure you upload that in either a PDF format or a Word format, because Brightspace doesn't recognize some of the other formats. Then I would take the chapter quiz. Use your notes, use the PowerPoint, use your book. It's a good practice. And because when we get to the module exam, we won't be able to use notes and it will be proctored. So if you have any questions, reach out. And then this PowerPoint that is fixing to play will kind of give you a brief overview of this chapter. Okay, students, so let's look at Chapter 1, and basically this is just like an introduction to what this textbook and what this course is going to cover. So we will start with biology and knowing that bio means life or living, and ology is the study of. So it's the study of scientific life, of living life. And it states here that organisms' adaptations to its environments are going to be the result of evolution. And evolution is going to be one of our fundamental principles of biology. So this chapter is also going to kind of cover the different themes of biology, and then it'll also talk about the scientific method. So we know that life has distinct levels of organization. We start from atoms, molecules, and then that molecules make up cells. Cells make up tissues. Tissues working together will make up organs, and organs working together make up that organ system that then forms an organism. Every new level is going to lead to emergent properties. Okay, and so life is an emergent property, so it's a complex biochemistry of metabolism. So metabolism is going to be all of the things that are going on, combining into self-replicating form, a cell. The structure and function are going to be correlated. The two main forms of cells are going to be prokaryotic and eukaryotic. Now, eukaryotic cells are going to have a membrane-bound organelle and a membrane-bound nucleus with the DNA housed in that nucleus. Prokaryotic cells lack that. And so things that are going to be prokaryotic are going to be like bacteria. They don't have a nucleus. That DNA is just floating throughout there. The way to remember eukaryotic cells are, you think of yourself, the way it's pronounced. You are eukaryotic cells because you have a membrane-bound nucleus, and we know that you have that DNA housed in that nucleus. Now, DNA is going to hold molecules hold hundreds of thousands of genes, and those genes are going to transmit the inheritance from one parent to the offspring. We know that DNA is arranged in a double helix, and each link of a chain is one of 4 kinds. It has the nucleotides. They're going to be abbreviated A, T, C, and G for adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine. DNA is going to be our genetic universal language, and the genes control protein production that is indirectly related, where RNA is the intermediary. Evolution is going to account for the unity and the diversity of life. So all forms of life of this planet arose by evolutionary processes, and that we all come from a common ancestor. So there's 3 kingdoms of life. So they're going to biologists divide the kingdoms of life into those 3 domains. So we have bacteria, archaea, and those are both prokaryotic. Remember, they don't have membrane-bound organelles or a membrane-bound nucleus. And then we have eukarya, which are the eukaryotes. So those are going to include 3 multicellular kingdoms. We have plantae, which they produce their food by photosynthesis. We have fungi, and they absorb nutrients and absorb their food from their surroundings. And then we have animalia, which obtain food by eating and digesting other organisms. So if we look back at evolution, Charles Darwin, he first published On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection in 1859. So he made two main points with that. He said that species showed evidence of descent with modification from a common ancestor. So that means they evolved and they changed from a common ancestor. And then his second point was natural selection is going to be the primary cause of descent with modification. So his theory of natural selection. So first he looked at variation, that organisms exhibit individual variation in appearance and behavior. So if we look over here, we have variation in neck length, and then we have the struggle for existence. So that's going to be overproduction, that most organisms produce more offspring than can survive. So then we have competition. So we look at this picture right here. So organisms are going to compete for food and for resources. Then this leads to adaptation, where individuals with traits best suited to their environment survive. So we notice here when we start out, we had a variation in neck length. So we had long necks and we had short necks. Well, notice everybody ate all these tree leaves off the lower end. Well, the survival of fittest or greater fittest right here, the short neck can't reach. So therefore they're going to die out and they are not going to reproduce and carry that gene on. So then this leads into our adaptation of where now we have long neck giraffes. So natural selection could cause an ancestral species to give rise to two or more descendant species. So for example, Darwin, he studied the finches at the Galapagos Islands, and he noticed that they all descended from a common ancestor. But he also noticed that their beak shape was completely different. And so that had to do with their food source. So a long-beaked finch is able to stick his beak into, say, a tree where insects, and into a hole where insects are hiding, whereas a thick, short beak like this one or like this one is not going to be able to eat those insects. And so it would have to survive on like large nuts and seeds and be able to crack those. So if there's not large nuts and seeds on that particular island, they're not going to survive because they will starve. So therefore that trait won't be passed on. Then we move on to the concept of basically science and studying nature. And science is going to be an approach to understanding the living world, whereas inquiry is the search for information and explanation of a natural phenomenon. The scientific process, or also known as a scientific method, it always starts by making an observation, forming a hypothesis, testing that hypothesis, then recording the data. And there's two types of data. There's qualitative data and quantitative. Qualitative is a description. For example, you're going to observe like behaviors of something or a color change. Whereas quantitative data is going to record measurements. And so like actual numbers, like how high or how much or the mass of something. Then we use inductive and deductive reasoning. So inductive is going to draw from a large number of observations, and inductive is a logical approach where a theory is developed. The theory is tested and then conclusions are then drawn. So when we look at the steps, we make an observation, we then ask a question, we form a hypothesis, which is going to be a testable explanation. It is always written in the form of a statement, not a question. Then we make a prediction based upon that hypothesis. Then we come up with our experimental design. How are we going to do this experiment? Then we test it, and then we use the results to either make new hypothesis if our hypothesis was rejected, or new predictions, or we come up with our conclusion. Now, in that experiment, you have a controlled experiment, and that is where you're going to have, it compares an experimental group with a control group. Your control group is where no variable is applied. And that control group is going to be used to compare to the test group to see, did our experiment change? For example, so say we have like three plants, and we want to see if, let's say, is Miracle-Gro fertilizer A going to make them grow more than non-fertilizer? So you have a control group, which would be one plant that no fertilizer is going to be applied to, and then your other group will apply fertilizer to it. So we have to know, after we measure our data, did the fertilizer make it grow, or did actually the control group, the one that did not have the independent variable applied to it, did it grow? It might have grown more than the one with the fertilizer. So we have to have something to compare it to. So that's your control group. Now, the independent variable is the variable that is being changed in the experiment. It's the one that's being manipulated. So, for example, the independent variable with the fertilizer, it would be the fertilizer is the independent variable. I'm applying fertilizer to this one. The dependent variable is going to be like what is measured out of that. Did it grow? What was the height of it? Then we look at a hypothesis versus a theory versus a law. So a hypothesis will provide a possible answer to an observed phenomenon. Now, what makes something become a theory? That is going to be when it provides a well-supported explanation for big pictures or concepts, and that has been used successfully to predict results in other research. So here's an example, like general relativity theory explains how matter interacts with itself, like gravity orbits. Another theory is the theory of evolution. Now, if we look at what is a law, so a law it provides the explanation of how a single mechanism operates, and it's usually based in pure mathematics. Never had an observation that didn't match the math, basically.